So about 5 years ago, I was going through a really challenging season, and while I was fortunate to have the backing of my administration and our team's culture was strong, my relationships with players were strong. They were as strong as ever, and they were as meaningful as ever. We weren't getting the results that we wanted on the scoreboard, and the results parents and others in the community wanted as well. And as we've talked about before, when you don't get those results, oftentimes you're going to face a lot of resistance and a lot of other challenges, no matter what other good stuff is happening within the lives of the people in that program. So it was a challenging season, to say the least, but in the midst of those great challenges, I decided to start a blog, and I decided to call my blog Thrive on Challenge. I had just read the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, where she says, people with a growth mindset seek and thrive on challenges. Now that really resonated with me personally because I did enjoy a good challenge in life. I knew personally that the greatest challenges I faced were some of my biggest opportunities and moments of growth. So I started the blog, and my first article I titled My Guide to Losing, where I shared about all the good that was happening within our team. Now, while we went on to win our district championship that season and turn things around, I think it's really important to remember that TOC, my book Calling Up, this podcast, they weren't born out of a championship. They were born out of one of my most challenging moments as a coach. And as I wrote my first article, there are a lot of books and blogs out there on how to win, but I don't think there is a lot out there on how to lose. The blog, the podcast, my book, all the work that we do with coaches, it's about helping coaches know who they are, know why they coach, and then stay true to that, regardless of whether if they coach a game well or if they coach a game poorly, whether they win or they lose, whether they're praised or they're criticized, whether they're being promoted or they're being fired. It's about staying true to who you are as a coach and why you coach. Now, I share all this because that's what episodes 175 and 176 are all about. We're not unpacking our coaching highlights, we're unpacking challenges. Those are where the growth happens. Now, if you haven't listened to episode 175, I encourage you to check it out, as Nate shared the story of him being asked to step down last season. And in this episode, number 176, we're going to break down some of the lessons learned and the perspective that we both gained through Nate's challenges. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, brought to you by Thrive on Challenge. I'm JP Nurbin, joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. Each week in about 30 minutes, we discuss important principles and strategies of transformational leadership. At Thrive on Challenge, we help coaches to raise the standards and strengthen the relationships in their program, because we know this type of culture produces better leaders, better people, and better results. To learn more about how we can help you, go to thriveonchallenge.com, where you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter and get the coaching notes to every episode of this podcast. So Nate, in last week's episode, we broke down last season's challenges for you. You know, the many, many challenges that you faced that eventually led to you being asked to move on. I think it would be a natural thing for any coach to, after that, sit back and reflect on, where did things go wrong? What could I have done differently? So in the last 9 months, have you come to any realizations or any things that, you've learned from the experience?
We've definitely spent hours and hours, thinking through the timeline and the order of events and the team meetings and the different games and the complaints and, reading back through the emails. I mean, you're retracing your steps, obviously, when you go through a failure like this, to try to figure out, where did it all go wrong? Where did the wheels fall off the wagon? And I think one of the challenging things about this particular situation is that there wasn't one event or one moment or one episode where it was like, oh, if I wouldn't have said this to the team, or if I wouldn't have told this player that, or if I wouldn't have chewed on the team in this way, there wasn't that singular episode where I could say that's where we lost the team. But I do think there's a lot of things looking back that I wish I would have done differently, or certainly that inhibited our ability to change course as things started to waver and wobble last season. And probably the most significant of those is we simply lost the flow of information. And, we've talked on this podcast before about how much I like to use captains in our decision-making process, and how important it is for me to get somebody that's going to represent the team, and whether it's planning practice or it's working through the schedule or how much rest we need. Like, I want input from the team, whether it's from individuals or from captains or from assistant coaches that are talking to players. That's always been really, really important to my leadership style. And I think, I was kneecapped in some ways because nobody was willing to share anything up the ladder. There was no updraft of information. When players were frustrated about the offense or about the way we were practicing or about the defense or about whatever, it never got to me. And so when we had that meeting over Christmas break and we were learning for the first time about all these frustrations and complaints, it was almost like it was too late to do anything about it, number one. And number two, my initial reaction to something like that would be go back to the leadership of the team and say, all right, how do we work through this together? Because clearly you have a better perspective on where the team is at than I do. So help me to make better decisions so that we can be better moving forward. And we just didn't have that at all. And that's really interesting when you compare it to year two, because I felt like I knew more about our team in year two than I maybe ever have in my career, because we were doing one-on-ones and two-on-ones and those consistent conversations. But for whatever reason in year three, that process totally broke down, and really inhibited our ability to problem solve using the players as partners to overcome some of those challenges.
Having walked, the kind of the road with you, I can see some of the challenges there that kind of came about when it came to that flow of information. I mean, for me, when I'm working with coaches, I am always craving information. Like, we're always sending out Google forms, trying to get as much feedback as we can so we continually maintain the pulse of the team and we can identify issues quickly. And the Captain's Council is a great, tool for that. But there has to be that kind of connection where they feel safe speaking to you. And for whatever reason, it just never happened. And a lot of times I always tell coaches, sometimes the leadership of the team is really, while you may select 4 or 5 captains, there's 1 or 2 individuals in there that probably pull more weight than others. And maybe there wasn't the connection made there that, they were then sending the signal, yes, we can speak up. Yes, we can tell them. So I'm not sure that ever happened for you guys last year, but I do think they were talking about their issues. They just weren't talking about them to you, your coaching staff, or the captains. They were talking about it with your athletic director, your administrator, and that just never allowed you guys to be able to identify and use that flow of information in a useful way. And I know we mentioned that in last week's episode as well.
Anytime, you're coaching a team and there are issues, or you sense that there's something going on, but you don't know what it is, having as many data streams as possible is obviously something that we lacked. So if we weren't getting information from our captain's council, or as much as we would have liked, we weren't getting it from any our one-on-ones either. We didn't use a Google form. We didn't, there were other ways that we might have been able to bring those things to the surface earlier. Might not have made any difference at all, but it may have allowed us to be a little more action oriented to address some of them before it was too late. Another thing I think back to is, one of the things I took for granted at the beginning of the year was that our culture was really strong. And I just assumed that because so many people had a good experience in year two, at least in terms of the culture and our work ethic and feeling that they belonged and that they were welcomed, that would just naturally continue, that those players, as they became seniors and juniors, would want to make sure that the underclassmen that were coming in were benefiting from that same kind of experience. What we didn't do, and again, I don't know if it would have mattered, but there were very clear signs from the end of year two going into year three that we were going to have playing time issues, because we weren't losing a lot of players, and there was going to be more competition for roles and starting jobs and that sort of thing. But we never really talked about, how do we want to handle that conflict as a team? How do we want to handle the disappointment of not getting what you want? Or how do we want to handle 2 guys competing for a spot when one might be a senior and one might be a sophomore? And I think maybe if we would have structured some conversations early in the year, thinking about, here's some potential points of drama or conflict on our team. Who do we want to be? How do we want to navigate them so that our team benefits, that our culture is still strong, that we still have a good experience for everyone coming out on the other side of some of those storms that might be inevitable just with the roster that we have this year. And we never did that. And again, would it have mattered? I don't know, but it might have.
Reflecting on your experience and a few other coaches last season, playing time was a growing issue, and players accepting their role. So when I took my team this year here in Ireland, one of the first things I did was I sent out a Google form, and I really wanted the players to identify from their perspective what they felt were the 3 top issues that we would face culturally, like this season. And one of those for us that are even at the professional level, our players articulated was playing time. So knowing your experience and a few others, what we did is we created what we called the playing time standard. And like all our other standards, this one was, using our core values to, okay, what does it look like when we don't get what we want, when we're not playing as many minutes as we want? And then what does it look like on this team? And so we created that playing time standard. Now, that's something that I just learned from that experience. I would never have done that in the past, but I've come to realize that when we're talking so much about like values and our program and creating standards, that oftentimes we create a bunch of fluff when, especially as you're moving from year to year, it's really important to hone in on like what are the really key issues. So we need to really come back to those things. So, I just really took that from some of your experience there too, is just how important it is to come back to, especially that standard around playing time and acceptance of role and revisiting those values, even if it sometimes seems repetitive.
I think there's something to that, because one of the reasons that I didn't feel like we needed to do that was because we had already done it the year before or the 2 years before. And so does it become another team meeting that's the same thing, with the same things on the whiteboard? And looking back now, I realize that conversation is probably really, really important year in and year out as players are adopting new roles and competition for spots, changes every year. And the conflicts or the challenges are going to be different from year to year as well. So it probably needs to be tailored a little bit to that team's, needs, but it probably is worth coming back to so that everybody is on the same page when we start to encounter the challenges that we anticipate. One of the other questions that I've kicked around over the last year is, how have I become a better coach because of this experience? And I actually asked one of my former assistants that with me at this school and before how she would answer that question, from her perspective. And what she said was that she perceives in me that I am even more committed to the things that we really believe matter. And, on this podcast before, we had Will Ray on talking about knowing what you're willing to be fired for, knowing what your non-negotiables are as a coach. And, it's one thing to say, gosh, I wish we would have had better feedback loops, or we would have done this team meeting, or we would have addressed conflict in a different way. In a lot of ways, those are skills that we all probably want to get better at, no matter where we're coaching. But I think there's also, for me, it was an affirmation that there's a certain kind of experience that we wanted to create in our program. There's certain cultural norms of effort and the way we were going to treat each other, that we wanted things to be earned. And so if there was going to be pressure to play upperclassmen, just because they're upperclassmen, I just wasn't going to do that because I don't believe in that. I believe that things need to be earned, and it would be undercutting the message that we've been trying to build into the program for 3 years if all of a sudden we started doing things differently because of a parent complaint or because of a administrative perspective or because of a player complaint that were counter to the things that we believe are most essential in our approach to coaching. And understanding that has probably given me more peace of mind in the aftermath than anything else that's occurred since I started spending more time with my family.
Well, I think another thing is that one of the great resistances that I see coaches face when they try this type of coaching is this hesitation to speak up, to become a player-led program. And you are constantly asking your captains for their input. But I've seen this not just in your program, Nate, but a lot of other programs where they're uncomfortable. They don't feel it's their responsibility. They don't want to take that responsibility. And when I first started to see that and experience that, I thought that was crazy because personally as an athlete, I craved those opportunities, to speak up. But it kind of makes sense in some ways, like they've been coached a certain way all their life. And then they come to you or they come to these other coaches that are asking their input and their influence. And some of it is just there is that uncomfortableness, but the other part is a little bit of a laziness, to really think about things and to try to be a part of the solution. It's a lot easier for people in life just to sit back and complain than to think about what could be a real solution in that situation. It's a lot easier for them just to complain and say that I'm entitled to these things than them to actually work for those things. And I think that in your case, some of that may have been present. It's just they weren't ready for that experience. And they didn't want that type of program. They didn't want that type of relationship with the coach. And it can be tempting for coaches in those situations to just say, okay, that's fine. I'm going to give back. I'm going to give up on that. I'm going to go back to in my case, the old screaming, yelling JP on the sideline, which some of my players wanted that. They wanted me to yell at them again. They wanted me to get on their case. They wanted to be more fired up in timeouts and stop asking them questions so much. But that would be letting them off the hook. And that also, most importantly, wouldn't have been staying true to myself. And so for you, I think that's just so important that through that experience, you were tested. You were tested to a point of, is this really important to me? And you made the commitment to stay true to those things. And I think every coach should know those things. And hopefully they don't have to be tested to the extreme measures that you were, but every coach should know those things. And I think that's just really, really something valuable that came out of that experience for you.
I think, JP, along the same lines, if we look a little more broadly and think about the challenges of when you take over or first take over a new program, I remember thinking in year one when things weren't going real well out of the gates and we had lost a lot of players and we weren't as competitive as, maybe we could have been. There's a temptation to ask yourself, are we changing too much? Are we doing too much different than what has been done before? And I remember thinking to myself, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, it's just the path that I chose was I'm a big Iowa State Cyclones fan. And when they hired Matt Campbell, who's now become this great celebrity and number one coach on everybody's list in the NFL, whatever. But when he started Iowa State, he transformed the culture there. And I just remember thinking they did so many things differently from day one. Did Iowa State bring Matt Campbell in to keep doing what Paul Rhodes before him was doing, or did they bring him in to do what he believed in? And he went all in on what he believed in. And so did I. It reminds me of another story of a coach in the Thrive On Community program that dropped down from the college level, took over a prep school at the high school level. And when she took over the program, her athletic director sat down with her and they created a 5-year plan to build the program. And it was philosophy, it was practice philosophy, it was offense and defensive philosophy, it was their values, it was their standards, it was on the court behavior, off the court behavior. It was an all-encompassing document that they literally spent months going through the details of how they wanted to build a program. And when they got done with the plan and it was approved by the administration, the AD said to the coach, now the hard part is we know that there's going to be a storm. At some time in the next 5 years, as we implement this program, there's going to be significant resistance and it's going to feel like a battle. It's going to feel like a war. And he said, we know it's coming because we've been through this before with other programs. And the key is that we just have to get to the other side. And he said to her, we're going to have your back. We will support you through it. We believe in the plan, but things will really start to take off when we get to the other side of the storm. And sure enough, it was year 3 in her program as well. Parent meeting after parent meeting, players threatening to transfer or to quit, and they weren't happy with the way things were going. And they just stayed the course, and they got to year 4, and a lot of those disgruntled, individuals were able to look and say, okay, well, if this is the way that it's going to be, I've either got to choose I'm going to fall in line or I'm going to go somewhere else or do something else. And once that happens, once players or parents or families or whatever have the opportunity to self-select them in or out of the culture, that's when I think the culture can really take hold and bear its fruit. but you really don't get that same return on those changes until you've gotten through the storm. And in our situation, either we didn't anticipate it or we just weren't willing to stay the course to see what was going to be on the other side.
And here's another truth of the matter. If you had gotten the wins early on in the season and you had the results to back up the culture, you probably would have gotten them a little bit more grace. Like Belichick went in and he changed the culture of the New England Patriots, but he also won a Super Bowl pretty darn quick. And that really helped to validate the type of culture that he was trying to implement there. And it's the same for a lot of other coaches. If you can get some of those wins early on, then it gives you a little bit more longer leash. If you don't, you're going to be even quicker to be on the chopping block in many cases. Now, for some of those coaches out there that are listening that are going through the storm right now, that are trying to be more transformational or trying to build this culture the right way, but they're in the storm, what would you say? Well, like, what advice could you give to them as they're facing that great resistance?
Well, the first and most important thing that I would say to coaches, JP, is that you've got to know why you're doing this. I think I went through a process where we became acutely cognizant of the cost, of the challenges, of the obstacles, that we were willing to face criticism and to go through some of the storms because we felt like our mission and our purpose was worth it. And it kind of reminds me of a story from my optometrist. And I know this is going to sound strange to talk about an eye doctor in the middle of this episode, but a couple of years ago when I was getting my eyes checked, Dr. Corpy told me this story. I had known for a long time. He's been practicing optometry for about 40 years. And for about the last 25 to 30, he's always gone on kind of his own self-organized mission trip to underserved parts of the world. So he would go to Africa, he would go to Central and South America, and his goal was to try to get into schools so that he could test a bunch of students' eyes, and then he would come back to the United States, and if they needed a prescription or they needed glasses, he would send them back to the school so the kids that needed them would have their first pair of glasses ever in their life, right? And so I remember asking him, it seemed like he was paying a lot of individual costs to do this, either out of his own pocket, he's doing fundraising, he's buying the glasses himself, he's taking his vacation and his time away that he could be spending with his family or doing all kinds of other things. He's paying an enormous cost. And I asked him, like, what makes it worth it for you? And he said, Nate, when I go to an area in Central America, for example, I'll try to get there for 7 to 10 days. And my goal is to get into school so that I can test 1,000 kids' eyes. And he said, when I do that, about 90% of those kids can see fine. They don't need a prescription. They don't need any adjustments. Their vision is fine. About 9% of those kids need a small prescription, something that might make words a little easier to read. Maybe they can read it or see at a distance a little bit easier. They could have survived without glasses, but their life will be a little bit easier with a prescription. But he said, the reason that I go and what makes it worth the cost to me is I am searching for the 10 kids that I know that are out there that can't see a lick. Their vision is so blurry, they will never be able to learn to read unless they get corrective lenses. They will never be able to drive a car. They will never be able to hold down a job because their vision is so blurry and there's no one in their life or in their village or in their community that can help them. He said, when I go, I'm looking for 10 kids out of 1,000 because I know that when they receive their first pair of glasses, it will change their life forever. And when I thought about that story, Dr. Corpy understands the cost, but he also understands the reward for others. And he has determined it's worth it for him to make those sacrifices, to change those lives. And I think sometimes when we're transformational coaches and we go through the ringer and we face all this criticism and resistance, we have to be cognizant of asking ourselves that question. But is it worth it to change the life potentially of 1 or 2 athletes a year? And when I look back at the influence that we had on kids, at my last job, I mean, we coached maybe 75 kids, and we've got meaningful, lasting relationships with about 5 of them. But we've made a tremendous impact on those lives. And when I look back and say, was it worth it to go through all that mess? I think that it was. And I encourage coaches to do that math a little bit to figure out what makes it worth it for you to endure the storm that you might be in.
So Nate, when you took this job, you left your hometown of Springville where you were coaching there, and you had won a couple state championships there, and we're kind of poised to potentially win another state championship there. And you come into Linn-Mar and you coached there for 3 years, and for many and for yourself, it didn't kind of work out the way that you wanted it. So I guess the last question I kind of have is, 9 months after, do you regret taking this job? Do you regret leaving Springville?
That's a question that my wife and I have wrestled with a fair amount over the last year. And there's maybe an even more interesting question of, if you would have known how it was going to end, would you still have chosen to leave and take this job? And obviously we can't change history and go back in time and and make a different decision. But I would address that, I guess, in two ways. Number one, there is no question that I am a better coach today as a result of the 3 years that I spent at this school than I would have been staying at Springville. I mean, the opportunity to innovate and to face new challenges and to coach different players and to try to build a culture in a different environment and work with a bigger staff. And you can go down the line, and all that I've learned about basketball and to prepare for all kinds of different teams, I've benefited in so many ways from that experience. And I'm grateful for so many relationships that we still have today that have come from that. And I think not only have I become a better coach, but I have a newfound perspective on how much I love coaching. When I got to help out my friend's team after I got let go at the end of last season in the postseason, when I got to go to the first summer workout, when I got to show up to our first practice this year, even though I'm just a volunteer assistant coach, I was so excited to be back in the gym and to be with a team and have my kids with me. It just has made me realize how much I love coaching and how much I value every day now that I get to be with our team. I mean, I'm having so much more fun because I think I appreciate it even more coming out of this kind of experience. And the last thing that I would add just to this question of regret kind of stems from this book by Andy Stanley called Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, which I've read since this episode happened in my life. But he has a question in there when you're thinking about decision making, and it's, what story do you want to tell? And in some ways, it's a legacy question. Like, how do you want to explain this decision to your kids 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or what have you? And honestly, that was a perspective that we had when we made the decision to leave initially. And the way that I would answer that is, the story that I wanted to tell my kids was that we left because of our faith, because we believed that we were called to go. When I think about, the character of Jesus in the Bible, and I think about him going to Jerusalem at the end of his life, and they celebrate the Passover, and there's Palm Sunday, and everybody's overjoyed, but he knows when he walks into Jerusalem, his crucifixion awaits a week later. He knows. And yet he still went. And of all the things that have challenged me in our faith when it comes to the character of Christ, it has been the willingness to be obedient, even if you don't know what's around the corner, even if you don't have the foresight to know how the story is going to end. I wanted to tell our kids a story that said, we believe we were called. We're not sure, but the only way we were going to find out was to go. And that's the story that we want to be able to tell.
A huge thanks to Nate for being willing and vulnerable to share his story with us today and unpack it all. I know he appreciates the many coaches who have reached out with emails and phone calls offering their support, encouragement, and gratitude after hearing last episode's story. It's always great to hear from our listeners, though. I know the majority of people find the podcast, just listening to the podcast, enough. They find it sufficient. But if you'd like to have a conversation with Nate or I, you can schedule a call at thriveonchallenge.com or just drop us an email. Our emails are in the details of this episode. Thanks for listening in to the Coaching Culture Podcast. And if you don't mind, leaving us a review if you haven't already, we also appreciate that.